So good morning, my name is David Laser. As we all know, Nelson Mandela was a man with a luminous faith in the unconquerable nature of human hope and dignity. He was, together with men like Lincoln, Churchill and Gandhi, one of the great political leaders of the past century and a half. Son of a tribal chief with connections to the Tembu royal house dating back 20 generations, he was an attorney at law, an outlaw, a freedom fighter, a fugitive, the founder of the armed wing of the African National Congress, and of course, for 10,000 days, 27 years, the most famous prisoner in the world. Husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and public symbol of rebellion and struggle, Nelson Mandela was Africa's greatest son. The prisoner turned president of South Africa's first democratic, non-racial government in 1994, and a man who came to personify to the world the enduring qualities of honesty, humility, simplicity, equality, justice, courage, and love. A man who showed us all how it is possible not just to make peace with one's enemy, but to love one's enemy. Our guest of honour here today knew this giant of history better than most because she was his private secretary, manager, spokesperson, personal assistant, confidant and protector for 19 years. Although born into a deeply conservative Afrikaner family, although a supporter of apartheid and by extension an opponent of any reforms that would give blacks their freedom, she became in many ways the embodiment of Nelson Mandela's commitment to reconciliation in South Africa. An example not only of how one man can transform a nation, but of how one man can utterly transform a woman's life. She is here today to talk about her nearly 2 decades with the world's most famous man and her recently published memoir, Good Morning Mr Mandela. Would you please welcome Zelda la Grange to the Sydney Writers' Festival. Good morning, Zelda la Grange.
Good morning, good morning. Good morning, David. Thank you very much for that warm welcome and great introduction.
Thank you. You were born in 1970 in Boksburg.
So I'm 45, if you're not fast enough.
Well, I mentioned the date for a reason,
Okay,
because there's been apartheid in place for 22 years, established in 1948, but of course prior to that there was 300 years of white domination and segregation. Can you take us back to the South Africa of your youth to help us understand the apartheid mindset?
Well, as you say, or as you said, apartheid was a system of laws dictating, indoctrinating, propagating that white people were superior to black people. And that's the way you lived in society. When you grew up, or growing up in South Africa in those years, if you lived in that confined environment of privilege, you didn't necessarily question what was happening outside the borders of your community. And me being on the receiving end of privilege in South Africa just because I was white meant that I wasn't interested in the liberation struggle. I didn't know. We were never cruel in a way to people around us, but you lived by a system, you supported a system, you prayed against the liberation struggle, basically. So everything in your life was controlled by the system. And automatically, when you don't question something, when you don't oppose something, you become part of the system. And people were quite surprised when I admitted in my book that I was a racist. But you have to start at the beginning and you have to admit that this is where I come from and I was part of the system, and living this life unquestionably makes me a racist.
So let's just look at what apartheid literally means. It means apartness, right? And a forced separation and a segregation of races, which was codified repression based on race. So you had the Mixed Marriages Act, which prohibited mixed marriages. Yes. You had the Immorality Act, which prohibited sexual relations between whites and non-whites. You had the Population and Registration Act, which labelled all South Africans according to race.
And by the way, black people were not even registered, so your birth and your death was not registered if you were black.
Okay.
It's inhumane to think of it.
Obviously, there was the notorious Group Areas Act, which was the foundation stone, I think, of apartheid. Beaches, theatres, buses, libraries, toilets, parks, all segregated. So colour is the single most important sort of arbiter, determinant of a person's worth, in fact. How deeply ingrained was that idea in you?
In me, in my mind, I was superior on every level to my black compatriots. I was never, because of the economic, the historic economic landscape in South Africa, you never engaged with a black person who had a good schooling, for instance, because we were separated. We lived by that separation. And the only people in our community were white. So you immediately, you start believing what the system is teaching you, that you are superior. So when you ask me that question, in every single possible way, I was richer, I was more beautiful, I was more clever, intelligent. On every level, I was wealthier, I was cleaner because I was white.
So in fact, you were God's chosen people.
Absolutely.
And the Dutch Reformed Church actually fortified that notion.
Very important, the church subscribed to apartheid as well. So it's your religion. How deep do you question? You can't question your religion. And growing up Reformed, growing up a Protestant, you just don't do that. You don't question your religion. You go with the flow. You believe what they tell you. So very deeply entrenched.
Was there any small corner of your heart or mind that was troubled by any of this?
Strangely, growing up in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, and even today, most of us had black workers in our houses. And the lady that brought me up, I was
This is Jochebed.
Jochebed, yes. Growing up, I was actually much closer to her than I was to my mother. Because my brother my only sibling is a mummy's boy, and I'm a daddy's girl. So my father was never at home, and Jochebed is the person that protected me against my brother. So I felt safe with her, yet she was the enemy. So there was that, but I didn't question it. You know, she lived in a little room at the back without electricity, without running water. But I used to feel safe going to her room. So, you know, as a child, you don't really unpack that and think about it properly.
She wasn't allowed to use the same cutlery as you.
No.
I mean, she wasn't able to use your house, in fact.
Yes,
except to clean it.
Yes. Not our bathrooms, and not our cutlery, not the same cups. That was very much apartheid, and it still exists.
Does it?
To a great extent.
But you loved her, and she was your lifeline, and yet it must have set up some kind of paradox, or did it, in your mind, that you've got this system and a mindset that supports the treatment of someone you love?
Not really at that stage, not at an early age. No, I wonder now, why didn't I rebel against this during the years I was a student? And I can't answer you. It's just because I was ignorant. As a young girl, my ambition in life was to get married and have 3 boys, 3 children. I was that specific. And nothing else. I couldn't care less about politics.
Your parents, supporters of the apartheid regime?
They were, yes.
So they were also, I mean, you described yourself in the book as a racist, growing up as a racist. Your parents were racists?
Yes, I don't want to speak on their behalf. You know, if you admit you're a racist, you have to do that yourself. Someone else can't do that. But the way of living definitely, how would I say, definitely shows that we were living racists.
Were you scared of blacks?
Yes. Inherent fear amongst white people that because we oppressed them, that at some point they would retaliate. And take revenge, so that created that fear.
So at night time you would lock the doors?
Yes,
and
because they were the majority and we were the minority, and we can't stand up against the majority unless we do so by law and oppress them through law. So as soon as it becomes dark, there's danger, because we're no longer in control.
Was it a happy childhood?
Yes, very happy. Ordinary family, middle-class family, but we had 2-3 holidays a year. whereas most black children don't even see the seaside until they're in their 30s or 40s, you know. But that was how different our lives were. But I was very happy, yes.
You were happy, but your mother had a deeply sad childhood, hadn't she?
Yes, she was neglected, abandoned. Her father died at a young age, so she was sent as the oldest of the three kids. She was sent to an orphanage to be raised because my grandmother couldn't financially support three children.
And your father, tell us a little bit about
He was a
him.
businessman, also a happy childhood, grew up on a farm, but a obsessive compulsive kind of person. But a good businessman and a very organized person. I think I get a bit of that from him, as well as the obsessive compulsiveness. And but yeah, very charismatic kind of person, but also difficult, very difficult, and very rigid in his beliefs.
So you describe your childhood as a happy one, but there's a moment in your book, and you're young, I think. You actually
12.
You're 12. You witness your mother trying to kill herself in the garage.
Yes.
That must have been a scorching, searing experience.
Yes, I'm only 12 years of age, and she must have known that I'm alone at home that afternoon. There was no one else, and Jochebed was off for the weekend, so she wasn't there, so it was a safe space, and I requested to go out and visit a friend, and she prohibited me, knowing that I would defy instructions, so I went out. And then when I returned, I heard the car idle. Now, she suffered of depression because of her upbringing, and I heard the car idle, and after a while I thought, but she's not leaving or coming back. At first I thought I was in trouble if she caught me coming in, and so I went to my bedroom, and then I heard, but the car's not leaving. What's going on? And then I went into the garage, and she was trying to gas herself. Yeah. Now, as a 12-year-old, you are very helpless. You don't know what to do. You don't know what's happening. You don't recognize. You don't know the term suicide at that age. So it was a very difficult day, but a day that shaped me well for the rest of my life, and I can only admit that now.
How did it? I mean, she survived that, of course. But how did that attempt by her on her own life to take her own life? How did that shape part of your character or your character?
It made me a very, very loyal person. If that day didn't happen to me, I wouldn't have this constant need to overcompromise, to please people, which is usually seen as a bad thing. But it's exactly that made me stay with Nelson Mandela for 19 years, because he needed someone to commit to him 200%, and I was willing to do that because I had this fear of abandonment.
By the time you were born, Nelson Mandela had already been in prison 7 to 8 years. When did you first begin hearing about him? And was it informed by your parents? What was the view of him that you grew up with?
It was actually the day of his release in 1990. It was a hot summer's month in South Africa, and I was swimming in our pool, and my father came outside, and he said, boisterous man, and he stood there, and he said, now we are in trouble. I said, why? He said, the terrorist has just been released. I said, who's that? Completely oblivious to who this was, and he said, Nelson Mandela. I said, oh, and I continued swimming. It didn't affect me, and I couldn't see how it would affect my life. And I thought, but you're the father, protect us, So it really didn't bother me. But that was the first day I heard his name.
So 2 years before, in 1988, Nelson Mandela had turned 70. He was still in prison after 25 years, and there was a free Mandela concert at Wembley Stadium, which was viewed by 600 million people. So as an 18-year-old, you had not heard of Mandela, really?
No, I wasn't interested. Remember that even a band like U2 and most bands those days boycotted South Africa with their music, so we couldn't get their music. But if you say that to a child, the child wants to get the music. But we didn't know what the messaging was behind the music. We just knew that South Africa is on the outskirts of the world. We're in trouble about something. We can't get the music, so we tried to get it illegally, which wasn't easy those days. But we didn't care about the messaging of Free Mandela. It was only really much later, 92, that I heard that there was this campaign, and still didn't pay much attention.
The year before Nelson Mandela was released from prison, there'd been elections. and the National Party were starting to flirt with political reforms, such as ending the Group Areas Act. Did you support the Nationals in their...
The Conservatives.
You supported the Conservatives?
I did not want us to abolish apartheid because it was a safe space. I was comfortable, so why abolish it? And I still had that belief of white superiority. So I was very comfortable in my space. So I voted for the Conservatives, not even the Nats. The Nats were liberal in comparison to the Conservatives.
You were hardcore.
I was hardcore.
Because 2 years later, there's a referendum, right? And
I voted no.
You voted no, and this is the referendum to give...
Yes, and I was proud of it, yeah. At that point, I was proud of it. You know, I've made my cross, and I don't want the apartheid abolished. This works for me. Not even thinking of the consequences or what I would... how my life would turn out after that.
Well, we're coming to that because the same year as the referendum, 1992, where you vote no for any reforms, you begin work at the Department of State Expenditure as a secretary. And you've done a diploma course to become a secretary. And you're there working as a secretary, and then 2 years later, Nelson Mandela is inaugurated, first democratically elected president of South Africa. At this stage, are you fearing a bloodbath in South Africa? Because many whites were.
1994.
In that 92, 3, 4 period.
Yes. We were on knife's edge in South Africa more than once. But now, looking back, and because of the leadership we had on both sides of the divide, we were able to overcome that. But for ordinary people in South Africa, we had that fear was increased, that, you know, we are in trouble now, we'll have to deal with the bloodshed coming. We were quite certain it was going to happen.
So Nelson Mandela becomes president in 1994, and you've been working at the Department of State Expenditure, but then suddenly you land a job as one of the secretaries in President Mandela's office. How does that happen?
By accident. I actually applied for a more junior position than the one I occupied, purely because I still lived with my parents at that stage, which no child should do at the age of 23, but I did. And I needed to find a job closer to home. It was just inconvenient for me to travel that far to the department where I worked before. So I applied for a lower ranked job, lower pay. And I thought to myself, you know, this can't be big. It's a typist position. I'm sure I'll be part of a typing pool because it is the president. You think, you know, you'll disappear in a big office. And then on the day of the interview, I actually applied for another job in the department. And on the day of the interview, fate stepped in, the door flung open, and his private secretary, the president's private secretary at the time, a black lady, entered. And she was desperate for someone to support her and to help her. And I was there, and she said, she didn't know why I was there, and she just said, I need a typist, and I need her right now, and I don't care if she's black or white. And of course, I thought, well, I'm your person, it's me. And she left, and they called me to say, would you be interested in a job in President Mandela's private office? So the only concerns I had was, is it in the head office, in the union buildings? Because I don't want to go to his house, you know. And secondly, would it be a sessional duty, what we have in South Africa? Parliament sits in Cape Town for 6 months, so all the office staff then moved to Cape Town, and I wanted that independence from my parents, so we're going to Cape Town. And when they said that, I said, well, I'm sold. I didn't care for anything else. I didn't ask any questions. I just said, I'm there.
And 2 weeks into your job, you meet President Mandela. What do you say to him?
That was really a watershed moment in my life, and that's why I also chose the title of the book. I walked into his private secretary's office to deliver a note, and this crowd of people came walking out, and then I found myself standing in front of the man that we considered the enemy. The first thing that came to mind was, I'm going to have to explain what I voted. I thought, you know, he's the president of the country, he knows everything, you know, so he should know what I voted.
Did you tell him?
No, well, later on I did. Oh, okay. It was water on a duck's back. But he actually, the first thing you noticed about him when you met him was the sincerity in his eyes. He had this infectious smile, and he's reaching out his hand. He wants to shake hands with me. And, at first I looked around and I saw, well, it's only me. He's meeting me now. I must shake hands with him. And as a 23-year-old, you don't know, are you supposed to shake hands with the president? You don't know protocol, you know nothing. I don't even know who I am at that point. And so I thought, well, I can't run away because he's surrounded by bodyguards that'll capture me, and my imagination is running. So I thought, well, what do I do? And I thought, okay, I'm shivering, and I started shaking his hand. And he held onto my hand. It wasn't just a hello and a goodbye. He held onto my hand, and he conversed with me, and I didn't understand a word he was saying. And I thought, what is he speaking? And I said, excuse me, Mr. President, could you repeat that? Because I really didn't understand. And I then realized when he repeated himself, he was speaking to me in Afrikaans, my home language. And it's not that his Afrikaans wasn't good. It's that the last thing your brain expects is that this person with the enemy, the language of the oppressor, this man would speak that language to you after everything we'd done to him.
And this is the language he'd learnt in prison?
Yes, to also charm the warders and his capturers. He was very clever and strategic in all of that. But so he spoke perfectly Afrikaans, and I didn't understand him. And he's holding on to my hand, asking him about my family, about my upbringing. He didn't ask what I voted. And then, you just as a woman, you're overtaken by emotions. I felt guilty. I felt responsible. And I thought to myself, I don't know, what did we do to this man? Why is he so kind to me? What is his ideology all about? What was this all about in our country? And I just started crying then as well. And I felt responsible, and he could obviously see that. And he still holding my hand, put his other hand on my shoulder, and he said, relax now, you're overreacting. So, and when a president tells you you're overreacting, you compose yourself, trust me.
Not only was it a huge thing to shake the president's hand, but I mean, this is the first time, am I right in saying this is the first time you'd ever held a black man's hand?
No, you know what, we were starting to integrate in South Africa a bit more prior to the elections. We knew what was coming. So working in government, we had this huge process of trying to start transforming government. So I started working with black people, but junior black people. So I was always the superior. That day, I was challenged for the first time, or actually the 2 weeks before, because suddenly I found myself in the surrounding where everyone is more clever than I am. They are well-spoken, they are well-educated, they dress better than I do. So you are confronted in every possible way, intellectually, everywhere. So I already started thinking about that, but then he was such a surprise, because you expect hatred. It's normal to expect him to be angry at me. And I was willing to apologize at that moment because he was so kind to me, but there was nothing, there was no expectation.
Was it part of his strategy to have you in his office? Was this part of a kind of rainbow coalition strategy? I want to show the world that if I've got an Afrikaner working for me, then we can do it at home and we can do it across the country and across the world.
In 1995, when he asked me to accompany him on a state visit to Japan, of course, I said no. I said, I don't have money to go to Japan right now. Because I thought, how do I explain this to my father? We're going off to Japan, inappropriate. But then I realized when he introduced our delegation to the emperor in Japan that he had a strategy. He wanted to show the world that going forward there was going to be space for everyone, even people with my history. We were going to be welcome in the new South Africa as long as you were willing to subscribe and support the ideals of democracy and equality. And I was willing to do that, so I bought into the strategy, but he definitely had a plan to show even in his most inner circle, the former enemy would be welcome.
So you went to Japan, and obviously the government paid for the trip.
Yes, they paid. I got danger pay, actually.
So in this early stage, I'm wondering whether suddenly it's occurring to you that this terrorist, that this enemy of the state, is actually a man who asks you about your family. He's got a beautiful smile. He's engaging you. He's holding your hand. And then you have your first meal with him. And I think you and some other members of the staff.
Yes.
A few weeks into working for him. And he starts telling you some of the stories of his time in prison. What are some of the ones that struck you the most?
Well, at that point, he had difficulties with his one eye because of the quarry on Robben Island where they worked. The reflection of the light damaged his eye, so he had to undergo an operation. And the eye was still recovering from that operation when we had this lunch. And I scraped together the courage to ask, so tell me, how did your eye get damaged? Because I've got no limits to my imagination, So I had all these things in my head about what happened. And he calmly explained to me, we worked in the quarry, and it's the reflection of the light that blinded my one eye almost, so it's light sensitive. And he went into a whole explanation. And of course, then I just broke down because I realized, what did we do? And I asked him, because I'm also very inquisitive, so I said to him, why did you work in the quarry? And he said, I don't know. I said, what did you do with whatever you did in the quarry, the rocks? What did you do with it? He said, nothing. I said, did they export it? Did they send it somewhere? Did they do something? Did they manufacture something? He said, no. And then he said it was a way of breaking down our spirits and getting to us emotionally, just doing this random work just to keep us busy. And so, of course, I broke down and started crying because I felt so sorry for this man. Here he was, the president of the country, the president of the world almost now, and yet he's got limitations because of what we did to him.
And then, of course, you start reading to him, don't you? I mean, not long afterwards, he asks you to his residence to, partly it's for translation purposes, but it's also partly to read to him because of his eyesight. Is that right?
Yes, especially when it was Afrikaans. He was just a strategist by nature. So if there was something in Afrikaans, he would call me to the house. If there was something in Xhosa, he would call Mary. If there was something in English, he would call the Indian guy. So he was very fair-minded about those things, but he would ask me to come and sit and read with him sometimes, or read to him.
And he was very particular about his newspapers, wasn't he?
Yes.
He didn't want anyone to open them for him?
No, then it's spoiled, yes. Meticulously, I mean, you can't open a newspaper. You can take out the ads, but do not open that newspaper because he will see it, and it's like, you've infected it almost in a way. And he would have to refold. He would refold the newspapers himself. Yes, himself, and putting the corners together, and that's probably as a result of prison as well. That routine every day that's forced upon you. But he would fold the newspapers perfectly, and you don't try and do it for him. He wants to do it himself. The same with blankets.
And shoes.
And shoes, yeah. He was very particular, meticulous about those things.
Yes, because he wrote in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, that prison was the still point in a turning world. And so I imagine that routine was the kind of reference for him of that still point in a turning world. Absolutely.
And the first few years as well, when I worked for him, he was without a partner. As you know, Mrs. Machel only entered his life in 1998, his last wife. So he was separated from his second wife at the time I joined him. So there was no one around him. He dictated, we all get up at this time, we all eat at this time, we all do this, that. And when he married Mrs. Machel, she made him relax a bit more. 7:05 is okay to have breakfast. There's not going to be a world war, or just relax a bit. So, he was very rigid with schedule and punctuality and discipline before she entered his life.
We know that after emerging from prison at the age of 71, Mandela said that the then President F.W. de Klerk was a man of integrity who he could do business with. This is after 27 years in prison, and he's declaring that his jailer was a man of integrity. And we then see immediately after becoming president in 1994, he establishes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate human rights violations on both sides. He then presides over a new constitution signed into law in 1996 that prohibits any discrimination against anyone, black or white. I'm wondering, though, if you can take us in closer to those qualities of tolerance and that capacity for forgiveness that you saw firsthand.
It would be completely incorrect to elevate him to saintly status and to think that he didn't have flaws like all of us, or shortcomings or prejudices, stereotyping people. He had all those things like any other human being. The difference is he tried harder than all of us to fight those every day. A very innocent incident. We had in South Africa you can determine who's Afrikaans and English by their surname. So Steyn, the surname Steyn is a very Afrikaans surname. And he had a bodyguard for 4 years who recently made news again in New Zealand, Rory Steyn. Rory was English speaking, English inheritance, everything English. And Mr. Mandela spoke to Rory for 4 years. He spoke to him Afrikaans every single day because he believed Rory was Afrikaans. And the more we would say to him, but Rory is not Afrikaans, it's fine, you can speak English to him, he would speak to Rory in Afrikaans. So, there was that. But he tried every single day to fight those and to break it down. And it was a decision, he also said, to forgive. So everything else in life, how you respond to something, it's a decision. And I saw that playing out every single day and him trying harder than most of us every single day.
I was so struck reading your memoir that at every public gathering he would greet the police on duty personally. He would shake hands with all the choir members. He kept pictures of all the previous presidents on his wall. And at obviously the famous 1995 World Cup, I mean, this was a moment that I think we will all remember, where he wore the Springbok...
Or you want to forget it, brother. It's fine.
Won't forget it. Well, he wore the Springbok jersey.
Yeah.
He wasn't even particularly a rugby follower, was he?
No, not at all.
But that jersey being a symbol of privilege and separateness. What did that do to the collective heart of South Africa?
Well, we were on a high for months after that, and coming down was harsh. But it was really, he used symbolism and he underestimated the power of symbolism because rugby was still considered a very white sport, but he knew if he used that symbolism, and he's the leader now, if he demonstrates his willingness to support this sport, he believed that, he could unite the country, and he did. And people were really, now a lot of people say it was very superficial, but still we would rather have that superficial moment than have nothing, because it is, in most South Africans, I think that still remains the highlight of their lives. Never mind of the history of our country, but of their lives, because they were part of it. You didn't have to be at the stadium, you could be in another city, you could be anywhere in the world. You felt that pride and a restoration almost of national belonging and pride in belonging to South Africa that day.
When did you feel yourself changing from within?
There wasn't a day and date that I changed. As I said, after meeting him for the first time, I started questioning a lot of things around me, my parents, my grandparents, my education, my religion. And that took me through a process which I describe now in the book as a metamorphosis, really, because it was a slow process of coming to realize what I was part of, and also being angry at myself for not questioning and not supporting people in their struggle, for allowing things just to happen.
Did you reject old friendships?
Yes, I did. As I was changing, I was also expecting people to change at my pace, which I later in life, Mr. Mandela actually told me, there's no use in trying to force people to change. You have to allow them to come to their own awareness of things. But at some point, I had to also, because I was becoming victimized to some extent, I would say, by my own community, because I was moving fast. I was changing faster than other people.
And also there'd been a documentary, I think, which showed you serving tea to...
Yes, to the president.
The president, and of course they still didn't like the fact that a white woman would serve tea to a black man.
No, and friends of my parents said, we can't be friends with the La Granges because their daughter serves tea to a black man. And that was hurtful not only to them, but to me, because my parents had nothing to do with my choice of working there. So, but that took us all through a process, and that was necessary. Even that hurt was necessary for us to have gotten where we are today.
Did you seek counsel on this one?
I went to a Dutch Reformed leader who was expelled from the church for standing up against apartheid. In South Africa, I'm not sure if you know who he is, but it's Beyers Nadeer. He was really anti-apartheid supporter. He was the first to speak out, and he was under house arrest for many years. And I went to him and I said to him, I've got a crisis with my religion. This is what you taught me. This is what you told me. And being a Calvinist, you know, everything is, it's fine. I'll believe what you say. What now? And I walked away from that with a calmness almost, but I had to do these things and speak to a lot of my colleagues, and I was just very lucky that they had the patience to explain things to me and to allow me to come at such a late stage through this whole process. And of course I had Nelson Mandela telling me these stories and you know, working at my heart every single day by being excited to see me, by respecting me. I'm someone from nowhere. Of course, it touches your heart and it opens you to change. It opens you up to change.
But you're not just challenging your own faith by going to this Dutch Reformed church minister. Your whole heritage is under question, isn't it?
Yes, but I've come to discover that who I am and what I am is not dependent on symbolism or on system. It is what's going on in here. It's what you do every day. It's the choices you make, and through that you can change at any stage of your life. It's not you're not fixed and molded to be ideology changes. Humanity can't change.
So, this girl from Boksburg is suddenly catapulted into the international stratosphere. Really, I mean, once Nelson Mandela is the president, and you're becoming his companion, confidant, secretary, and you begin travelling with him, and you realise, of course, you don't have to pay for those trips by now, right? You end up going to places, Buckingham Palace, for example, and meeting the Queen. What was Nelson Mandela's relationship with Queen Elizabeth like?
It was fabulous. It was really fabulous. They had a very warm relationship, a very relaxed relationship, and I think he saw a side of the Queen that few other people had the privilege of seeing. He was always the same, so whether it's you or me or the Queen, you know, he was always the very same person. But on one occasion, for instance, we arrived at Buckingham Palace. He always paid a courtesy call to her, whether he was there for a day or for 5 days. He always made sure he went to see her, have tea. And arriving at Buckingham Palace, there's this long red carpet. Of course, if you're Nelson Mandela, you get there on the red carpet. So I saw in his face that there was 1,000 devils in his eyes. He was working at something. He had a very good sense of humor. And as he walked up to her, he was thinking of what to say. And as he looked at her, he said, "Elizabeth, I'm happy to see you. You've lost weight." So I think it's one of the very few people that would comment about the Queen's weight. And then later...
Did the Queen have a response?
Mr. Mandela's wife, yeah, she burst out laughing. She enjoyed it. You know, she realized that you are probably the only one that could get away with that. But later, Mrs. Machel, Mr. Mandela's wife, also said, but you can't call her Elizabeth. You must call her Your Majesty, you know. And he said, why not? She calls me Nelson. So that was him, yeah.
What did you call the president?
I called him Kulu, which is an abbreviated version of Tatom Kulu, which is the Xhosa word for grandfather.
And what did he call you?
Zeldina. He changed my name. I don't know. He just decided one day. He had this strange way of doing things, and he just announced one day, "Your name is Zeldina now," because it's actually a Portuguese thing where you add, you know, the letters I in A to the end of any name. So, and then he was reminded of that in Russia when we were there on a state visit, because Yeltsin's wife was known as Yeltsina. And then he called me and he said, "Oh, I've changed your name, it's now Zeldina." So that stuck.
1996, a very significant year for Nelson Mandela. He announced he would only be serving one term, 5 years as president, but also it was the year he divorced Winnie Mandela, and that his relationship with Graça Machel became publicly known. Now, as many of us would know, Graça Machel was the wife of the former president of Mozambique, Samora Machel, and her marriage to Nelson Mandela in 1998, on his 80th birthday, made her the only woman in the world to serve as the First Lady of 2 countries.
Yep.
What was her influence on Nelson Mandela?
It's also I think you need time and you need a bit of age to really understand what that relationship meant to him. But in summarizing, he is the one person that really made her happy. He was truly happy when he was with her. It's as if I describe it in the book as it's as if someone drew the curtains. Whenever you went to his house before that, he would sit by himself. There was no one around, sit by himself having meals. It was lonely, it was dark, it was somber. And then she entered his life, and it's like, the sun just came in. And it was beautiful to witness that even this statesman, even this renowned figure could be so vulnerable, almost in a way, by love. It was beautiful, beautiful to watch.
And he would attempt to learn Portuguese as an act of love to her, wouldn't he?
Yes.
He would go to bookshops and buy Portuguese dictionaries.
Yes, the tapes, when you still got the tapes. He actually bought the whole set. But I don't even know what happened to it, but we only managed good morning and good evening in Portuguese. There was never going to be time for that.
It was the gesture rather than the fact.
Yes, it was. It was very cute. Yeah, that he would even attempt.
He went to bookshops a lot. I mean, he obviously just not because he was necessarily going to read the books that he bought, but just to be amongst the people.
That was his one excuse. It's either buying books or buying a pen. I mean, how many pens can you have? And I bought more Oxford dictionaries in my life than any other person alive. When we would end up in Sydney, he would say, "Oh, I want to go to a bookshop." For what? No, I want a dictionary. Okay, then you would know. It's actually just to be amongst people and to connect with people. It was very difficult. He was almost a second-time prisoner after his release because he couldn't move anywhere like we would. And you take those things for granted if you have it. You think it's, I'm just going to the shop to buy a bread. Those ordinary things in life, when you don't have it, you miss it. So his excuse, he wouldn't buy bread, but he would go and buy books. Even the same book over and over and over again.
You describe how in the early days of Nelson Mandela's presidency, if he had so much as a common cold, the rand would plummet, rumours of his ill health. He'd become a symbol of stability to all South Africans. But in 1999, he steps down as president. But before he does so, he calls you into his office and he asks you to retire with him. What's your response to that?
I'm too young to retire. No, I really said that at first, and then he laughed because I knew what he meant, but it was a huge honor being picked by him. Then to serve beyond that, I don't think I applied my mind. It was still that thing of, please just don't abandon me, I'll do anything. But I didn't have the skill then to set up a post-presidential office or to become his spokesperson or his foreign affairs liaison, nothing. I had zero of that. Strangely, he knew how far he could push me. He knew my abilities better than I did. And it was just, okay, swim, go for it. And I didn't even think about it. I just said yes.
And during the next, 9 years, a huge amount of travel. I mean, 5 to 7 public events a week. You've set up the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And I mean, he's an 81-year-old man moving towards his 90s, and he's going to Germany to meet, and you're going with him to meet Chancellor Schroeder, to Tunis, to Tripoli, to meet Gaddafi, to Iran, to see Assad in Syria, Israel with Prime Minister Barak.
To Sydney.
To Sydney, and in fact, to meet John Howard.
Yes.
Yes, and where didn't...
we actually had lunch at his house here on the river.
Oh, that house, that old pile.
Yes, that house. And we went to the zoo as well, yeah.
I think that it was here in Sydney that Nelson Mandela gave you chapter and verse on the inside of a kangaroo pouch, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, he did.
He liked to tell you what he knew.
Yes,
And
yes.
he knew a lot about kangaroo pouches. What did he know about kangaroo pouches?
I don't know where he read these things, but we were actually in Melbourne staying at the governor's house, and there was this beautiful garden with the kangaroos, and then he would recite everything he knows about kangaroos. It was quite strange, but he loved wildlife, he loved nature. So it was limited. Of course, he wasn't very knowledgeable, but he knew more than I did.
By 2000, you've turned 30, as you write, and you've never had a normal relationship after starting work with Madiba, with Nelson Mandela. And as a result, you write, I still lack the emotional maturity to deal with very ordinary things. What did you mean by that? You
know, the school of life is very strange because you get given a certain path to follow. For ordinary people, going through the motions of breakups and good relationships and bad relationships and having kids, you take it. You also take it for granted that those things, you know, automatically happens. When it doesn't happen in life, you don't evolve the way you should. I look at my friends with their children, or those who are still married, or those who are divorced, what they've been through, and I realized, but you know, my path was completely different. So that emotional side of my development, I didn't evolve with those relationships because I didn't have them.
Because you describe a beautiful moment on a flight from South Africa to Germany with Nelson Mandela, and you're exhausted, and you wake up and you notice that there's a blanket over you and a pillow behind your head, and Mr. Mandela had done that for you. And on another flight, I think, he passed your seat. It was a flight to Britain. He passed your seat and he covered your feet with a blanket. How did you react to that?
It was almost hurtful, you know, that I'm here to look after you, and I don't deserve this, yet you are struggling, you know, to walk even at that stage with movement. He's elderly, he's frail, he's fragile, and yet you worry about my open feet. It's painful then realizing that, not because I neglected him, but that someone really loves you that much that they worry about you.
So it touches the deepest part of you?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Because I think you wrote that no one had ever really done that for you.
No. But also because if you were in a normal relationship, a normal way of life, those things would have happened, you know. And this was my life and a love story without the romantic kind of love.
At what point in the relationship do you think there's become this deep mutual dependence?
I think when he started aging, because it's very difficult for a person when he ages, him or she, when you need reliability, you need predictability around you, you need to know that the other person knows exactly what your expectations are. And because of the journey we've traveled together by then, it was easy for me to know this is what you want. You don't have to say it. I can, you know, spare your energy. I know what to do. So it was that created this dependency, but also me trying to please him. That was the codependency. I would please him. I would do anything for him, as long as he didn't abandon me. So it worked well in that working situation.
I mean, it wasn't just codependency or mutual dependence. It was almost you were enmeshed, because in 2001 he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and he said to you, I don't want you to be alarmed, Zelda, but we have prostate cancer. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, now, he knew my sense of humor also by then, so I said to him, we can't have prostate cancer. I'm very sorry, but yeah, always the collective.
We know Mr. Mandela had 6 children, 3 of whom died. 4 were with his first wife, Evelyn Mace, 2 with his second wife, Winnie. He also had 4 stepchildren with Mrs. Machel, 21 grandchildren, 17 great-grandchildren, a notoriously fractious family. How difficult did that make it for you?
Very difficult. I would, every night I go to sleep, I would say, I'm leaving tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm leaving. And the minute I saw him the next day, I would forget about my undertaking to leave. He made it the job worth it, but that environment of such a fractured family, it's 3 different families, 3 very strong families. And at the end of the day, I just had to remind myself, who do you work for? Who pays your salary? You don't know who to listen to because you get torn between all these people. And who do you actually listen to? And I had to come to that realization that I'm serving him. I'm not working for a family. But it's very easy to get pulled into the politics and so on. That was very difficult.
And as he's getting more and more frail, you're being more and more sidelined, aren't you?
Yes.
Who's the architect of that? Who's orchestrating that?
I wouldn't want to name them, but I think that it becomes clear in my book that there's parts of it's like your family, my family. So we are 20 people when we get together. There's personality clashes. There's people I don't get along with in my family. So you can't expect also to work for someone with such a large family to get along with all of them. So I had my favorites. I had people with whom I had good relationships, and those relationships are actually still intact now. There is a bond we share. But the people I didn't get along with, we still don't speak. It's not as if we've got anything to say to one another.
You had a tough time, though, being, in a way, the gatekeeper for Nelson Mandela, didn't you? I mean, people called you all sorts of things: bitch, lioness, witch, Rottweiler. Was that tough?
Yes, it was, because I was very young and I was very sensitive at the time. But then also he was the one that gave me the courage to deal with it eventually, and strengthened me with support and confidence. But it was very difficult in the beginning, and those names, I mean, they still call me those names. I just had to get to know myself better and realize what my vulnerabilities are and not allow people to use my vulnerabilities against me.
What do you think you learnt most from Nelson Mandela?
Respect. Respect to deal with a person irrespective of ideology, appearance, status, wealth, whatever. Just to connect with that person, because there is a soul with value behind everyone. And once you do that, once you apply that every day in your life, life becomes beautiful, because you find people that you never otherwise would, just because you respect them.
So he changed your heart?
Totally.
And he changed the hearts of his people? I mean, black and white hearts. Would that be fair to say?
It's fair to say, although I think like South Africa, like anywhere and everywhere else in the world, we are facing our fair share of problems going back in history right now, where people discriminate, where there's a lot of racism and so on. But it's important for me, it's a calling for me now to keep that legacy alive and to remind people that if we had a Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk so hostile to one another, or with the same hostility that we find in our politics in South Africa now, we wouldn't have survived the transition between 1990 and 1994. So it took leaders from different sides to respect one another. And I believe anything could be overcome with exactly just that.
I was so touched in the book when you were writing about your father, this man who had warned you that the terrorist has been released in 1990, but then when Nelson Mandela dies in 2013, what's his reaction then?
It's the first people I called, obviously, the morning after Mr. Mandela's passing, as my parents, and my mother she tried to console me and so on, and then I said, well, can I speak to my dad? And she said, well, he's been up all night, he was following things on the news. I took a sleeping pill, I admit, because I knew, it was happening and so on, and I knew what was to be expected the next few days, so I went to bed. And my father watched the announcement, and as the news unfolded, and she said, wait, let me call him, and she tried, and she said, no, he's inconsolable. So, I wanted my dad also at that point, and I wanted to hug him, because somehow this man has also touched his life, and I wanted to console my dad as well.
At the end of your book, you write, I don't know what I will do with the rest of my life. Perhaps I will find a man to spend time with, one who knows and will respect that a piece of my heart has already been taken, given to an old black man who was once my people's enemy and is now lying like an ancient king deep in the soil of South Africa's golden hills of Kunu. And then I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong here, but you say in Afrikaans, tot weersins Kulu?
Yeah, until we meet again, Kulu.
Until we meet again. Well, Zelda la Grange, tot weersins Kulu, until we meet again. Would you please join me in thanking Zelda la Grange?
Thank you so much, David.